Hey everybody, it's Stacey Adelman here, and I'm a registered psychologist and owner at Joshua Tree Learning Center in Regina. And I go live every Tuesday at 12 and talk about a whole variety of different topics and try to answer some questions that come in about a variety of different kinds of issues here. And so this week, what I really wanted to talk about was what is scaffolding and how can it help my child who has ADHD? I was a teacher for years before I became an educational and counseling psychologist. And one of the questions I get probably the most is how do I help my child who has ADHD? Number one, it tends to be with learning and with behavior. And so there's a term I use called scaffolding that is something I usually talk a lot about and really highly recommend when we're working with kids with ADHD. So, scaffolding is a term that is used when we want to talk about applying, structure, consistency, and routine. So that's the number one recommendation I usually make for children, teens, and adults who have ADHD: structure, consistency, routine. So when we talk about scaffolding, I want you to think about a scaffold at a job site. And what that does is it's giving a lot of structure. It's a framework, and it's something that can be applied to a situation to help teach kids. All kids, not just kids with ADHD, but I think it's particularly important when working with kids with ADHD. So, how can scaffolding or a scaffold or a structure be used to help kids with ADHD? Well, the number one thing I often hear from mostly my teens and my adults is um, be direct and get to the point, right? That's the number one message they want. You tend to want people to know and to understand. So, not using a lot of fluff or a lot of extra language or being vague. It tends to be really helpful to be very clear, direct, precise, and to the point, brief and to the point. So, for example, a lot of us, adults, for example, especially when we're dealing with maybe a challenging behavior, tend to get into kind of fluffy language, right? And explaining why a certain behavior is important because they're going to need this behavior, when they become an adult and so on and so forth. None of that resonates when an individual has ADHD. What they need to know are very clear guidelines and expectations, and it needs to be brief and to the point. Number two, keep expectations high. So, just because somebody has ADHD does not mean they are not capable of behaving, not capable of learning. In fact, it's the opposite that is true. Individuals with ADHD tend to have very high ability, very good ability, tend to be very creative thinkers. And we are not serving anybody well when we decrease the expectation on them, because what that does is it communicates to them, you're not capable of behaving this way because you have a disability. That is just not true. It's very disempowering and it's just not fair. And so individuals with ADHD are very capable of learning particular behaviors. They're very capable of learning. We just have to get more creative and structured and consistent in terms of how we teach them. So I really wanted to make that clear. In having a structure, we also need to keep the expectation high that they are capable of achieving. So what we're going to do with a scaffold now is in order for them to achieve that expectation, we will have to break down the task into smaller parts and achievable outcomes. So how are we going to break this down? And sometimes that can be kind of challenging. But what we do know is every action has a prerequisite skill that has to be learned. Learning how to sit in your chair, there are actually prerequisite skills that have to be learned to be able to learn how to do that. So how are we going to break that down into small, achievable steps that are clear, structured, and communicated in a very clear, structured way? Okay. The same is going to happen with behavior. It wouldn't be enough to say, go and get ready for school. That's too fluffy. That's way too open-ended. What does that mean? How can we make that into a structure or a consistent routine that has small, achievable steps that I know I have achieved as I get ready for school? So an example might be brush hair, brush teeth, put on pants, put on socks, put on shirt, put on jacket, come downstairs, eat breakfast. Let's break it all up into those small component parts that an individual should be able to say yes or no. Did I complete that action? Yes or no. Another one I hear a lot about is clean your room. And then maybe that child misbehaves or is kind of goofing around or not getting anything done, turns into a bit of an argument. How do we break down clean your room? It might be pick up the socks, put the socks in the bin, pick up the towels, put the towels in the bin, pick up the Legos, right? Put the Legos in the yellow bucket, take the yellow bucket downstairs. So you might want to have to communicate each of these things step by step to show them the process of how to clean up their room. Now, how do we communicate? Sometimes we can communicate it verbally, but I find we always want to try to use a multisensory approach as much as possible. So I really advocate for pictures, right? I like having a picture schedule so they can look at that picture. Even better if it's a picture of themselves in the picture, being able to complete each of those steps, and they can look at it and say, did I do that? Right? So we're going to break it down step by step, one thing at a time. So the next thing I hear a lot of individuals with ADHD will say to me, well, Stacey, it's not too hard, it's too much. So be careful of how many structured assignments or tasks we're getting that individual to do all at one time. So you might just want to focus on one task at a time, because when they see a whole bunch of tasks laid out in front of them, that can also look extremely overwhelming and will shut down that part of the brain that will help them get to initiate that task. It just looks like they're going to be there forever, when in fact that isn't the case. So just scale it back and focus on one thing at a time. So how does this translate into maybe a learning task, either in the classroom or at home if you're helping your child with homework? Okay, so perhaps maybe they have a math sheet to do, and there tend to be some battles over homework, right? So how do we break down that math sheet? Because I've had a lot of individuals say to me, I look at that math sheet with all those questions, it just looks like, way too much, and they don't get started. Again, how can you break it down? Well, when I taught, I used to cut the worksheet up into pieces, and I would give out one question at a time. So give them one question. When it's done, they give it to you, and then you give them another one, right? Or maybe you want to cover some of the sheet up with a piece of paper so they can only see one question at a time. I worked with an individual who had a very well-established career, who would take work home and just couldn't get going with it. And it's because it was all so visible, right? They would see these stacks of files and things that they had to get done, and it just looked impossible to get started. So what we did was we just focused on one file at a time, and the rest of the files went into a closet where they would be out of sight, right? So again, how can you focus on just one thing at a time? Okay, so it's really, really key when you're doing a learning task. How do we break it down? If someone is struggling with the actual task of learning a skill, then it's our job to figure out how can I break that down into multiple steps. So this happens a lot in math, or can happen a lot, for example, in writing, right? Where we would say to somebody, I want you to proofread this paragraph. Even though that individual is highly capable of proofreading that paragraph, it just looks like too much. And there's too many things they have to think about at the same time. So just scale it back, scaffold it. Say, okay, I want you to look for all of the places we need capitals. Now I want you to look for all the places you need a period at the end of a sentence. Now I want you to check spelling or whatever it might be. How can we break it down? Maybe we don't show them the whole paragraph. Maybe you show them one line at a time, right? So sitting there encouraging and harping on kids to get their homework done isn't going to help them get it done any faster. We got to be creative, and we have to use scaffolding as a way to help them accomplish the task. And so we are the ones that have to change how we present it to them. So much with working with individuals with ADHD is how can we change how we're communicating or how we're interacting into a way that they can understand and accomplish exactly what it is we're asking of them. Okay. The same can be when we're teaching social skills, for example. Individuals who maybe are having some difficulty with relating to their peers. How can we take that skill and break it down and teach them in a way that they can start eventually learning that skill and applying that skill in real time, right? So it's one thing to learn it in isolation, but I think we really have to focus on learning it in real time. So again, scaffolding can be used for social skills as well. So I hope that gives you a few ideas on how you can incorporate scaffolding and helping kids with ADHD. And I think we'll be talking a lot more about ADHD and learning challenges on Tuesdays at 12. And thank you so much for joining me today. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Take care.